Chapter 13. Eirik lay awake in bed one morning at Gunnarsby. Jorund was putting on his clothes in another corner of the room. Cecilia came in from outside with something and exchanged a few words with her husband. Then Jorund said, "Will you not speak to your brother of that matter we talked of?" "No, I have told you I will not." Jorund muttered something in anger. Then he followed his wife out. Eirik got up and dressed himself. When he came out, Cecilia was sitting on the earthen bench outside the house with her son in her lap. The child crawled over his mother and wanted to be caressed. Cecilia pressed the boy to her, but looked as if she were thinking of other things. Eirik greeted his sister and stood looking down at her. "What did Jorund wish you to say to me?" "Since you heard that," Cecilia glanced up with a clear, cool look, "you must also have heard my answer." "Was it about my leaving the convent?" asked Eirik. "Has that made it worse for you here at Gunnarsby?" "Oh, 'tis not that alone." Her eyes still rested on her brother's tall and handsome figure, as he stood before her with the morning sun shining down on the bright locks of his bent head. He was dressed in a dark red gown which reached to the knees and fitted his broad shoulders well, a leather belt with silver buckle about his slim waist. She liked him better this way. It had revolted her to see her lively, handsome brother in the frock of a barefoot friar. Never could she believe that that was a life for Eirik. "There is much else." Eirik said, "Even with a sister's portion in Hestviken, Jorund will get more with you than his brothers got with their wives. Brynhild has 4 brothers, and Lucia's father had to make dear amends to the king for the foolish game he played when the duke lay before Akershus." Cecilia nodded. "Jorund knows that. They all know it. But that makes it no easier for Jorund now. We live here, the youngest of this crowded household, and we must bow to the others in everything." "Is it Mistress Brynhild?" asked Eirik. "Brynhild I like best. She says what she means. But it is true that she and Jorund have never been friends, and Ark and Lucia do not like me." Eirik looked down at the young mother. He had guessed this during his stay here. Neither Jorund nor Cecilia had an easy lot. "Tell me, then, what Jorund wished you to say to me," he asked her. "Tell me," he repeated, as his sister blushed but would not answer. Suddenly, with a movement of impatience, Cecilia set the babbling child down on the ground. The infant rolled over and made ready to scream. Eirik took him up on his arm. "It will be no longer than to Clement's Mass, and then I shall have another one like this." Cecilia drew 2 or 3 deep breaths. "I cannot deny. I would give a lot if I could be spared giving birth to the child here in the hands of these brothers' wives. Even if Hestviken is to be yours, could we not live there together? He and Ark could never bear each other. Jorund has wished this ever since we were married. He begged me. It was one of the first nights we slept together. He begged me to ask father if we might take up our abode with him. But if he could wish that, if he would rather dwell with father, who is so glum and hard to get on with, than his brothers, then it would be all the easier one day when father is gone and you are the master. You and he have been fast friends so long." "Is it your wish," asked Eirik, as Cecilia had to stop and take breath, "that I shall speak with father? Ask him if you may come out to us by autumn?" "Yes," said Cecilia, and blushed again. Eirik handed her the child, which was struggling to get back to its mother. Then he turned and went to find Jorund. All that forenoon the 2 friends were together on the outskirts of the manor. They walked hither and thither, sat or lay on the ground, and Jorund talked without ceasing. He swore that he had not taken it amiss when he heard Eirik was not to be a monk after all. He at least had never forgotten that probation was probation. But Ark and Steinar and their wives had uttered words which provoked Cecilia to retort, and Eirik knew well enough how stubborn and unbending she was when she thought differently from others. She often did so here, and it generally happened that there was some truth in what she said. But it was unbearable for them to stay here. The dissension between him and his brothers had become 10 times worse since he had married Cecilia. But if they came to Hestviken, he was sure he could live happily with her. Then he began to speak of the table silver in Cecilia's dowry. Ark's wife had found out from Magnus, the goldsmith of Oslo, that this was the old silver that Olaf had brought out at the betrothal feast. Olaf had had it refashioned, but that, they declared, was cheating his son-in-law of the heritage, and Cecilia had given them an answer. Eirik's head reeled with listening to Jorun's complaints, when at last they returned to the manor. As Eirik rode homeward, he was determined that his father must yield, though it might be difficult to obtain the old man's consent. What happened was the only thing he had not looked for. Olaf said yes, without hesitating. So Jorund and Cecilia moved to Hestviken that autumn. They were given the women's house to live in. Soon after, Cecilia gave birth to her second son. He was called Thorgils, by mistake. The boy came into the world half suffocated, and the women fetched in Eirik to baptize him in emergency. In his hurry, he gave the child the first family name he could think of. Olaf was angry. The boy ought to have been called Audun after his father and his little dead son, and he had no wish to have Foulbeard's name perpetuated in the family, though the man's offspring had used it, and 2 of Arn Thorgilsson's daughters had named children after their grandfather. One day Eirik said to his father, "Could you not be less curt of speech with Jorund? He thinks you don't like him." "No, I cannot," said Olaf gruffly. Then he added, already a little more graciously, "Jorund can hardly expect me to treat him as if he were still our guest, now that he has taken up his abode here." Olaf had reached a point where he was no longer able to keep up his ill will toward Eirik. The young man had compelled a certain respect from his father. He was now in his 2nd year at home, and the change that had come over him since his stay in the convent still lasted. Olaf noticed that Eirik always tried to do what was right, and had achieved a mastery over himself which Olaf would have sworn he could never attain. His father felt something like shame when he recalled that at first he seemed to have expected and almost wished that Eirik would relapse into his old bad ways. Without any design on their part, without their even being clearly aware of it, they drew more closely together, all these people who for so long had formed one household. Since Jorund Reaper's coming, they felt that they had grown into unity, and he was a stranger. He idled among the houses as though out of place, doing nothing. Nor had he a hand for any of the work which was to be done on this manor. He went out in the morning, stood at the stable door, and watched his man grooming the horses which were his. If the weather was not too bitter, he sauntered down to the pier, stood there a while looking out and spitting into the sea. He had been out with the boats a few times, but then he would go no more. Then he lay dozing on the bench in his own house. There was so little sleep to be had at night with the 2 children, he complained. When Olaf and Eirik came in with the boatmen, this was in the fishing season, he turned into the old house and sat there. But the men were tired and hungry, and had no thought of beguiling the time with Jorund Reaper. When the season for catching auks came on, he revived somewhat and went out with the others. But then they had a week of tearing northerly gales, and that put an end to it. The others saw little of Cecilia. She spent her time in the women's house, or with the maids in the cookhouse and outhouses. There was a great shortage of fodder in Hestviken that year, as they had Jorun's beasts as well as their own, and they had to make use of an old byre that had been in a tumble-down state as long as anyone could remember. It was mended in some sort, but the starving animals suffered horribly in it. Cecilia would come out in tears when she had been feeding the cattle there. Not often had anyone seen her weep for what might befall folk, but one evening as she came from the byre and met Eirik in the outer room, she threw her arms about his neck in the darkness. "Eirik, you who pray so much to God, can you not pray that spring may come early this year?" "I do so. You know it well." After Olav had gone to bed that evening, Eirik went to him in the closet and told his father what he had been thinking, that they should take up the farm in Saltviken again. Olav thought they had more profit of the land using it as they did now, for pasture and hay, than if they let it out at rent. Eirik replied that he did not mean they should take a tenant there, but should carry on the farm with men from here. "If Jorund is to keep 10 cows and 4 horses here at Hestviken, then we ourselves must raise far less stock than before, or move some of it out." At last he got a kind of consent out of his father. Eirik took with him Knut and Svein, Ragnar's young sons, rode south only a couple of days later with 2 boatloads of fencing. They spent a whole week there, making ready what they could. No sooner was the frost out of the ground than he set off again, this time with some of the cattle, and before Halvard's Mass, Eirik had fenced in most of what had been the home fields, with bush fencing, if nothing else. In time, even his father would have to grant that he was right. This could be made into a good farm. Olav Audunsson himself had been into Oslo for the winter fair, and as usual he had made some bargains which were to be completed by Halvard's Mass. He would now send Eirik into the town, and Eirik asked Jorund to go with him. The brothers-in-law stayed in the town a couple of days over the feast. They had met acquaintances, and in the evenings they drank in one house or another. Eirik had a care of himself. He would not enter any of the places where formerly he had been too well known. This was one of the reasons he had asked Jorund to accompany him. If he was with a married man, it seemed more natural that he should refuse to go to the common inns, but confine himself to the halls of the guilds and the townsmen's houses. Another reason was that he guessed Jorund was weary to death of Hestviken. The evening before St. Eirik's Day, they both came home late to the armourer's yard, and they were in drink, so that Eirik overslept himself the next morning. On that day, at any rate, he had meant full surely to hear Mass among his own brethren. He had not succeeded in reaching the convent since the first day he was in town, but once more it was too late. The Masses were now over in all the churches except St. Halvard's. He would have to go there, and to the Minorites for Vespers. But as he prayed during the Mass, the thought came to him that he would ask at the convent for some cuttings of the great cherry tree below the hill. Near the houses in Saltviken was a hollow beside a sunny ledge of rock, just a place where fruit trees might thrive. There were many places at Hestviken too, but his father had laughed at him when he proposed it. This was no knightly manner that they should plant rose gardens or pleasances. But Eirik already thought of Saltviken as his own manor. When he came back to their lodging, he heard from Galfrid that Jorund had gone out with some men who lived in Brand's Hard. He went after him, and found his brother-in-law in a house at the far end of this yard, in company with some men who kept cocks there. First they watched the cockfight, and then they went into an upper chamber and drank. After a while some women came in. One of them, called Gyda Honeycake, Eirik had known in the old days. She seated herself on his knees, and he drank with her, fondled the wench too a little, thinking all the time that the wisest thing he could do was go his way, but feeling ashamed because of the other men. Then the dice box was brought out. Eirik had no desire for gaming, since he had promised to keep himself from such things. But it was not always possible. At the same time, he was shy of refusing before the others. There happened to be a man there, one whom Eirik did not know, who said he didn't care to throw dice, but was there anyone who would play chess? Here he was freed from 2 temptations at one stroke, since he could not play chess with Miss Honeycake on his lap. So Eirik declared himself willing and set the girl down, not without a secret regret at being rid of her. But the stranger, Helg, was so good a chess player that Eirik soon forgot all else in the game. He would have liked to stay away from vespers too, but when the bells began to ring he remembered the cherry trees, and now he had set his heart on them. So he took his leave. Jorund stayed on. Eirik saw that he was already far gone in drink. He himself had been sobered by his zeal for the game, as soon as he had found how skilful an opponent he had. Jorund was playing wildly, but Eirik gave little thought to that. The man was always lucky at dice. Besides, he was married now. He could surely take care of himself. And it had already passed out of his mind when he stood once more in his own church and joined in the singing of Ave Maristella and the Magnificat. After the service, several of the brethren came down to him, and he went with them into the convent. Now he had to talk with them all, and soon the hour of the evening meal arrived. The end was that Eirik was to sleep in the guest chamber that night. Next morning after Mass they could take up those shoots for him. The fruit trees were far advanced, but Father Einar thought that if the shoots were well wrapped in moss and birch bark, and he sailed straight back to Saltviken and planted them that evening, they would take root. Eirik was in church for Compline and slept in the guest chamber. And in the light spring night he was roused by the monk, who came with his hood drawn over his head and whispered, "Benedicamus Domino," and he went to matins, and back to bed again, and to Mass. Then for the first time he remembered the purse with the money he had received from his father. It lay at the bottom of his bed in the Richardsons' house. But surely it was safe enough there. When once the brethren had procured the cherry tree cuttings for him, they found many another thing to give him from their garden. Eirik carried the whole load down to the boat, got hold of an old sail, and wrapped his cuttings to keep them from the sun. It was high noon before he returned to the armourer's. There he was told that Jorund had come in for a moment the evening before, but he had not been home that night. Eirik walked into the town to seek out his brother-in-law. In Brand's yard he met Helg, and from him he heard that late in the evening he had gone with Jorund Reaper to a house where no man would have liked to find his sister's husband. He was still sitting there when Helg left. Eirik asked Helg to go thither with him, but when they came to the house they were told that Jorund had gone home a little while before. So Eirik went back to their lodging. There he found Jorund, engaged in packing their belongings. He looked somewhat the worse for wear. Eirik could not bring himself to say a word. He put together the last of their baggage. When he felt in his bed for the purse, it was gone. "I have taken charge of that," said Jorund. "I could not tell how long you would be taken up with those brethren of yours." Eirik turned sharply on his brother-in-law. But then he swallowed the answer that was on the tip of his tongue. It was bad enough as it was. It would be made no better by talking about it. So they went down to the boat. During the sail they did not exchange an unnecessary word. Eirik was glad enough they had none of the housefolk with them, so Cecilia would not hear of her husband's doings. After supper that evening Eirik gave his father an account of how he had discharged his business. "Jorund has the purse with the money?" Jorund Reaper stood up. "Dear father-in-law of mine, sooth to say, I don't have the money here. It fell out that I met a man who made a claim on me. I was in his debt for 1.5 marks of silver. A dalesman it was, the man who sold me greylag, but he had gone home when I had the money for him. So now I borrowed this money of yours to be rid of the old debt." Olaf stared at his son-in-law till Jorund was out of countenance. "Yes, we were throwing dice too. I am so used to having luck with me in my play. I had looked to win enough to pay this Simon what I owed him. But here is this silver beaker, which is worth much more than the silver I borrowed from you." Jorund took a handsome little cup from the folds of his kirtle and placed it on the table before his father-in-law. "You must take this." Olaf seized the cup, crushed it in his hand, then flung it right in the face of Jorund Reaper. "I have not asked for your cup. My silver I will have, neither more nor less." Eirik had leapt up. For a second he saw something in Jorund's face, and he was chilled through with fear. This should not have happened. Jorund looked down at the twisted cup that lay before him. Then he put his foot on it and trod it flat. "Take your beaker," said Olaf, so that his son-in-law obeyed. Then Jorund went out. Eirik and Olaf stood in silence without looking at one another. Then the father asked in a low, angry voice, "And you? Were you gaming too?" Eirik shook his head. "He must have done this the last evening we were in Oslo. We went each our own way. He went to one of his kinsmen, and I was with the brethren, stayed there the night." "Did you know no better," asked Olaf cuttingly, "than to lie out there playing with your rosary when you had him with you? You ought to know your friend." "It is an ill thing to set a sheep to herd a fox." Eirik stood in silence. For all that, he should not have done it, father, but he dared not say it. Eirik could not fall asleep that night. He ought not to have left Jorund. His father was right there, more than he knew himself. For he did not know what sort of company it was he had left Jorund in. He might have tried to get Jorund to church with him, but he had shrunk from that. He had wished to be left in peace with those friends of his for whom he had a different kind of affection from that he felt for Jorund. But for all that, his father should not have done it, flung the cup in his face and treated him as a thief. Eirik gave a low groan. Jorund would never forget this against his father. And if they were now to live together here, he had a feeling that forebode he knew not what disasters. Then he bethought him of what he had lying in the shed at the waterside, wrapped in a ragged sail. He must have it in the ground as soon as might be. Both Father Einar and Brother Hubert had told him that. Eirik would just as soon avoid meeting either his father or Jorund or Cecilia on the morrow. He got up and stole quietly out. The fjord lay pale and calm in the spring night, which was already turning to dawn. The gently heaving swell licked at the yellow band of seaweed under the rocks. The gulls sat on the surface like white spots. Now and again one rose and flew out. But in the pine forest, which filled every hollow of the mossy grey hills along the shore, the song of birds awoke little by little. The pale grey clouds in the south were tinged with red, and the northeastern sky turned to orange as he rode along the broad, curving, white, sandy beach of Saltviken. Inland was a great plain, poor pasture with a few alders which the salt boilers had spared, and huge old junipers in shape like gigantic spearheads. Eirik rode past. He had a mind to look at the nets which he usually had lying out off some rocks in the south of the bay, whether the boys had seen to them while he was from home. As he rode back again, A score of fish lay floundering in the bottom of the boat. The houses stood a little way from the beach, half hidden from the sea behind a low ridge of rust-coloured rock which looked like the back of a gigantic whale. Inland the soil was broken by more such whalebacks as it sloped up to the edge of the forest. As he passed the door of his house, Eirik heard his dogs. They knew of his coming. He let them out and received their joyful welcome. But the boys, his housecarls as he called them, slept heavily, Knut and Svein in one of the beds, and Olav Audunsson on the bench. Eirik had moved him hither, for he could see that his beadsman was irksome to them at Hestviken. He would serve in any case to mend their clothes while they lay out here with no woman's help. But he had to shut up the dogs again while he was planting. They would scratch up the seedlings as fast as he put them in. He had almost finished his work when he heard the boys going to the byre. The sun had already been up some time. The fjord and the land on the other side lay bathed in the fresh, pale morning light. When the lads had brought out the cows and let them into the fenced field that he meant to sow with corn next year, his task was done. He went down, greeted them, and gave orders about the fish. Then he threw his muddy garments to Olav Audunsson, took a deep draught of the warm morning milk, and flung himself into his bed, feeling that he would sleep on till evening.